Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kara. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the program coordinator at the Partnership for the National Trail System, or PNTS. Today, I will be serving as our webinar moderator. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Onondaga and Haudenosaunee people. PNTS recognizes that land acknowledgements are an important first step to acknowledge that we are on stolen Indigenous lands. I will provide a link in the chat where you can explore what native lands you reside on. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Partnership for the National Trail System, PNTS is a small nonprofit that is a collective voice, a resource provider, and a hub for exchange, learning, and action for the National Trail System. As the only 501c3 nonprofit focused on the 30 national scenic and historic trails, PNTS brings together professionals, leaders, trail and hiking enthusiasts to promote a thriving, accessible, and inclusive national trail system. The Partnership for the National Trail System is proud to present today's webinar, a comprehensive approach to inform user management on trails and public lands. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to everyone that registered following the live presentation. The session today will go for about 35 to 45 minutes, and we will have time at the end for some Q&A with our presenters. As we go, please feel free to put any questions you may have into the chat for this Q&A time at the end. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters, Dr. Aerin Jacob, conservation scientist with the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, and Dr. Annie Lucen, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Northern British Columbia, and also with the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. And now I will hand it off to Aerin to get us started today.
Thanks so much, Kara. And what a treat to see how many people registered for this session. It certainly, recreation is something that's a really important part of my life, as well as science, as you'll see. And so we're really happy to talk about the research that we've been doing and in this multi-year project. I'm talking to you from my home in Canmore, Alberta, in Treaty 7 territory. And as Kara said, land acknowledgements are one small part of the things that we all need to be doing to understand and to do better in the future, how we live on the earth and with each other. And we can put some resources in the chat too to help people do that. So the work that Annie and I will talk about today is a multi-year research project, and we are partway through, which is really exciting. This is where we start to really get our scientific teeth into the meat of what we're doing, and it's a lot of fun. One of the reasons it's a lot of fun is that in addition to being scientists, Annie and I love outdoor recreation. It's one of the reasons we live where we do, we work where we do. One of the ways that we plan our lives is to spend times in these marvelous outdoor environments, places that help to fill our spirits, our souls, and regenerate us for the kind of work that we do. We care a lot about doing science and using science to help take care of these places, both in our backyards and around the world, and for future generations, so that people will be able to experience these kind of places and have marvelous experiences with their families. We were really happy to get this invitation to present with the Partnership for the National Trail System. And to prepare for it, we learned about PNTS, and what an amazing group of folks who are involved in this. 30 national scenic and historic trails all across public lands, all across the 50 United States, administered by multiple federal and state agencies and non-governmental organizations. We are people who like collaboration, and that is a collaborative project. And with the mission to empower, inspire, and strengthen public and private partners to develop, preserve, promote, and sustain the national scenic and historic trails. Let me tell you, I cannot wait to explore some of these places. And we'd like to learn a little bit about the people who've joined us today. So Kara is going to queue up a poll just now so that we can get to know you. So please take a moment and tell us, where in North America are you located? We asked this question based on registrations, and at the time we hadn't seen anybody from outside of North America. But if you are somewhere else in the marvelous world, please let us know. So seeing those numbers coming in right now, it's like a horse race. And most people are coming from northeastern US, but we've also got sizable representation from Western Canada, Southern region, the Pacific coastal region of the States. And that's terrific, all across this marvelous continent that we call home. We have another question for you in a moment. Looks like the answers are ending. I'll let Kara share the results from that one and ask the next question. The next question we have is, we want to know, what sector do you primarily represent and or work in? People are joining today because they might be scientists, they might be at government agencies charged with the management, the planning, the stewardship of some of these areas. They might be involved in community groups who love outdoor recreation and want to make sure that it gets better and better for people and for nature. You might be involved in for-profit and in private ventures. Maybe you're a business owner or involved in tourism and recreation businesses. So it looks like just about everybody's 100%. Excellent. And so we'll end that poll and share the results.
All right, people should be able to close out whenever they're ready to do so for the poll.
Thanks, Carol. So I'll end that and continue.
Yep, good to go.
So a little bit about the organization that we are from. You may already have heard about Yellowstone to Yukon. If you haven't, Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative is a nonprofit organization that works in 2 countries and has been around since 1993. The Yellowstone to Yukon region is huge, nearly 3,500 kilometers long, stretching from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem all the way through the Northern American Rocky Mountains, through the Canadian Rocky Mountains, stretching up into the Northern Yukon Territory. That is 1.36 million square kilometers. It's twice the size of Alberta or twice the size of Texas. And this is a marvelous, marvelous place. The mission of Y2Y is to both protect and connect habitat so people and nature can thrive. And those ands are really important. This is about positive futures for people and for the non-human creatures that we share these places with. People get so much from the Yellowstone to Yukon region. It's really important that we make sure that these places will be protected and connected for generations to come. And that means that Yellowstone to Yukon works on a whole variety of issues that includes protected areas, reducing impacts of roads, human-wildlife conflict, appropriate development, the relationship of science and conservation to law and policy and social science. You can find out more about Y2Y, the work that we and our partners do, on our website. In the Yellowstone to Yukon region, if you haven't been here yet, although I bet a bunch of you have, this place has been home for people for thousands and thousands of years. Indigenous homelands, people who have lived and stewarded these lands for generations and who are still active in these places and in the stewardship of those places. The Y2Y region has glaciers, mountains, lakes, and rivers that provide drinking water for millions of people all across the continent. This water flows in every direction across the continent. And these are working landscapes. We get a lot of our wood, food, and natural resources here too. The Yellowstone to Yukon region offers extraordinary opportunities for outdoor recreation. So whether you are looking for the thrill of a lifetime or just a chill weekend, if you're into it for exercise or for fun, and no matter who you are, these places have extraordinary opportunities for recreation. And the last 2 years have certainly shown us how important access to nature is for our physical and mental health. And that recreation is growing. People today are going farther, faster, and via different means than we have ever done before. So this has implications for recreation and tourism-based economies, for small towns that are trying to adapt to change, often unexpected change, and of course, overarching with climate change. But it's hard to study recreation. Most things that involve people, our preferences, our behaviors, our activities, are complicated to measure. And that brings me to the discipline that this project is in, and that's called recreation ecology. A typical definition of recreation ecology is the scientific study of environmental impacts resulting from recreational activity in protected natural areas. But it's a lot more than that. It's not just about protected natural areas. It's not just about environmental impacts. It's about the linked social, economic, and relationships among all of those things. But typically, recreation ecology, recreation research has focused on site-specific and small-scale studies. That means studying one species, one trail, one recreation activity, and/or one season. An exception to that is some wonderful work that's been done recently by one of our partner organizations called Headwaters Economics. If you haven't checked out their stuff, I really encourage you to do it after the webinar. They have resources all about recreation across the United States, and a really neat project that's working on some of these issues. But recreation affects so many different aspects of our lives: the social, cultural, economic, environmental, safety, health, and interrelated parts of our lives. And the increasing demand on natural resources and recreation use, uncertainty with climate change, and rising conflict among users means that we have to study these things in a holistic, in a comprehensive way. Unfortunately, we are living in a technology boom. There is more data available than ever before. So what we need to do as people who care about recreation, scientists, managers, nonprofits, private sector, we all need to be coming together to study this in a comprehensive way. Broad-scale applied research needs collaboration. And that's because people have different interests and responsibilities. We have different tools and skill sets, and we all have different perspectives about what the future should look like. So more equitable, effective work means working together. And we're fortunate to work with a lot of different groups on this project. For instance, we work with federal, provincial governments in Canada. We work with other nonprofit organizations, and we have many funders. This, one of the lessons for us in the last couple of years is just how many people are interested in the results of this work. And we'll talk about a little bit of that as we go on, including some surprises. So I want to zoom in now to where we're doing this work. I said that the Yellowstone to Yukon region is huge, and our study area is also very large, more than 60,000 square kilometers in Western Alberta and Eastern British Columbia. So this is just north of the American border, north of Montana and Idaho. You can, if you're familiar with Canada, you'll see that Calgary, which is Canada's 4th biggest city, is just outside the eastern boundary of our study area. That's 1.4 million people. And something that you might not know is some of the legacy of natural resource extraction in the area. Although there are quite a number of protected areas, and you'll see those in the next slide, we are also looking at a legacy of logging, mining, oil and gas, and the roads that come for all of those activities. So I want you to be thinking about many of the small towns that are in these places. Small towns and people, families that were formerly dependent on natural resource extraction. And now they're shifting to different economic bases. That can include amenity migration, tourism, and recreation. As well, large parts of this area are important climate refugia. And that means that although we know that the Earth is changing, the world climate across the globe is changing, some places are changing slower than others. So these places are called climate refugia. They're places that might continue to have snow long into the spring, when other places will not. So here's a zoomed in example of our study area, and it's big. The Upper Columbia region is in British Columbia, and that's just over 45,000 square kilometers. In Alberta, we cover Banff National Park, Kananaskis Country, and the Ghost Public Land Use Zone. It's important for people to know that this is mostly, quote, public land. It's not as much private land here as there is across in other parts of Alberta or across the border into the US. There are multiple protected areas, and those are shown in green. These are provincial and federally protected, and they're increasingly busy landscapes inside and outside of those parks. I said we're trying to do this in a holistic way, and that means looking at multiple types of recreation activities. This means working in summer and in winter, motorized and non-motorized activities that occur on and off trail. It's both commercial and non-commercial use. And it's a gradient of use all across the region. Some places might have little or almost no use, and some places might have a lot. It's a mosaic. We also look at multiple species. Evidence shows that many species are sensitive to recreation, and that can be from motorized or non-motorized activities. There might be certain thresholds for the number of people that cause an impact for those species. Could be related to time of day, season, or life stage. And some animals might habituate, but others might not. Some animals might leave a busy area, while others might be forced to stay there, even if they're stressed out. This has important consequences both for species at risk of extinction, as well as for human-wildlife conflict. For our project, multi-year, multi-jurisdiction, multi-activity, multi-species, has three main objectives. The first is to map and classify trails. The second is to measure and model the intensity of human use. When, where, how many, and which activities are happening across these landscapes. And the third is to model important wildlife habitat and compare that to human use. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Annie Lucen, who's the project lead for this, to take you through those three aspects.
Thanks, Aerin. And I'm going to take control of the slides as well. So I will start out by getting into the meat of this project here. Usually there's a delay. There, okay. So when we think of recreational use, and many of you are probably associated with trails and mapping trails in some context or capacity. And we often think of trails as generally being mapped and maintained by government authorities. So this is a screenshot here, for example, from the province of British Columbia, where you can access different data sets. Okay. What we're seeing throughout North America is that there's a growing trail network from users, and that information isn't necessarily being captured on these government portals or sanctioned or known trail networks. And this is a result of a lot of changing technology. So as a user, I can go into a social media platform and upload a trail that I recently discovered. And then others can go onto the same website and follow those trails. So there's a growing trail network that's not necessarily captured by government authorities. And there's also a growing interest in recreating outside. I think that was really highlighted in the last few years with people needing to really get outside to connect or reconnect with nature under COVID. And at the same time, there's discussion about whether the same social media that gives us access to trail information is at the same time, quote unquote, ruining some of these areas. So this is a snapshot of an article from British Columbia asking whether social media is ruining hiking in BC. So this might be a question other folks have asked in your local regions, and what are some solutions to dealing with that? So when we think about this increased network of trails and increased popularity and human use, there's a number of ways that it can impact us. So from a safety perspective, it's been shown that emergency services have been affected more than ever. And in talking to a recent or a local conservation officer, they said that all rescues begin with All Trails. So All Trails, again, is a user contributed platform. And while it might be a slight exaggeration, it does highlight the fact that people can be going onto these user contributed trails and getting into conditions they may not have anticipated and calling for emergency. So there's stress on those services from an ecological standpoint, which is most of my background. This network can also fragment wildlife habitat, or it could also displace or stress wildlife that are occurring in the area. And then from a management and planning perspective, it's obviously difficult to account for or plan for what is unknown. So if you're working off a provincial or state database, but there's actually new trails being put in, it's difficult to know what the impact of that area is. But this can also result in conflicts between recreational user groups. So for example, an area that's getting a lot of mountain bike activity the hikers may move to a different area to recreate because it's become so popular with bicyclists. This can then lead to decreased visitor satisfaction. And then underscoring perhaps all of this is the uncertainty with climate change and how this can impact the ecological aspects of this project. Throughout this, and Aerin sort of touched on it in the beginning, there's really a need to study the impacts of recreational use on environment and people. And in the academic literature, there hasn't necessarily been this focus, but that's shifting in the past few years. So this study is really aiming to fill one of those research gaps and as well as a management gap. So with this project, as I said before, one of our main objectives was to map trails. And here we looked at trails both from government sources, what we call known trails, as well as non-government sources. So in total, we've mapped approximately 55,000 kilometers of motorized and non-motorized trails. About 2/3 of those were previously known. And I use known to symbolize what was in government databases. And those are shown on the map here in orange as those trails there. And then about 1/3 of the 55,000 kilometers were newly identified from non-government sources. So these include data from various online sources, which I'll talk about in the next slide. These aren't finalized numbers because we're still working on this project and refining the results. The map I have shown here is a zoomed in map of 5 national parks in eastern BC and western Alberta. And the big one you've probably all heard of is Banff National Park. And for us, national parks represent agencies that really have maybe the most resources to put into maintaining these databases. And yet still we're identifying additional trails, which are shown in purple. And zooming out, you have a pretty busy map there that I'll walk you through. So this map represents, again, data sources represented by orange. Those are, again, the known trails. The background layer there are the parks and protected areas. Those are provincial and federally protected lands. And then we have the new trails in purple. So you can see that there's new trails being added to the map in purple, and that varies depending on where we are in the region. So the bottom right, you can see there's quite a number of trails that have been added. And the data sources here are from OpenStreetMaps, Trailforks, Strava, things like that. And something that also took quite a bit of time was digitizing quote paper maps. So they might be non-georeferenced PDF maps, for example. So that's in purple. And then the gray lines underneath represent resource or forest roads, cut lines, and pipelines. And this is actually a big data gap from both provinces, is understanding how these forest roads are being accessed for motorized use. So the take home here is, number one, there's a lot of trails and linear features on the landscape. And number two, that we're identifying additional trails that aren't necessarily being captured by government databases. So with this effort, there's a few lessons we've learned. Number one, it takes a lot of time and work to update these trail data sets. It took about 1 year for one person to work through these, and still there's incomplete information. So that's one big lesson. Number two is agencies generally lack resources to keep up with these dynamic situations. In general, there's a lot of support to better understand how recreation is influencing these landscapes, but because things change so quickly, it's hard to be so adaptive. And number three, it's important to understand how the current trail network information is used, especially within a land use planning framework. There's a big need for that in a lot of our areas within our study area, and that information needs to be put into these land use planning frameworks. So bullet 1 from this project was understanding mapping, and bullet 2 is understanding how humans are using these footprints. And this is where we want to think beyond just what is the linear footprint from human recreation. This map here does show the extensive footprint from humans. The red areas are resource roads, so they're legacy roads from forestry and mining, and you can see they're really extensive. Also shown on here are grizzly bear areas in blue. When we're thinking about moving beyond just the human footprint, we know from more recent wildlife research that human use or intensity of use can have differing or even greater effects on wildlife than the human footprint alone. And this was shown with some research during this COVID pause. For example, in Italy, grizzly bears or brown bears are avoiding human areas spatially and temporally. And then third, it's important to understand not only how often people are recreating, but what type of recreation. This graph, you don't need to understand the details of it, but I'll walk you through it. So on the horizontal axis, we have the recreation type. So we have hikers on the left, horseback riders, motorized users, and mountain bikers on the right-hand side. And on the vertical or y-axis, you have a ratio of how much avoidance or traction there is by different wildlife species. And the different wildlife species are shown in different colors. But the key message here is that motorized users and mountain bikers have a stronger negative effect on wildlife compared to hikers and horseback riders. So this type of research is recently coming about in the recreation ecology and wildlife literature, and it's helping us better understand how we're having impacts on our natural ecosystems. So to better direct our knowledge of the intensity of human use in our study area, we have data from a number of different sources. So what we call on-trail use, we have data from Strava. This is mostly used by non-motorized users, and it's essentially a platform to track where you're going in space and time. So we can get a count of people on those trails. We also have trail cameras and traffic's infrared trail counters. So we get another index of human use on trails. And we also went through the process of social media scraping. So essentially getting information, geo-referenced information on social media posts, for example, Instagram and Twitter, to identify those in space and time. And then we also have information from off-trail use. For us, because we're interested in summer and wintertime use, we wanted to capture this information, which is hard to capture with a trail counter when everyone is moving off of a trail. So to do this, we met with recreation experts and we captured data such as this map here. So we have larger spatial areas where people indicate the number of users over time. And we've also done a bit more traditional data gathering with aerial surveys. So the key takeout from this slide is we're using data from a number of different sources using newer and older data methods. But back to the aerial surveys. We did these aerial surveys specifically to fill a data gap for the off-trail users in winter, and specifically snowmobilers because they don't use Strava data loggers. So we did aerial surveys in about a 7,000 square kilometer area within our study areas. Again, it filled data gaps and it allowed us to monitor changes within seasons as the snowpack changes. And it also allowed us to compare recreation intensity across different regions. So this map gives you an aerial overview of a small part of our study area, and we're flying essentially fixed transect lines and observing recreational activity across this grid. And we recently did a number of these surveys. Actually, just last week, we took some of these photos where we're flying that grid I showed you before and recording the intensity of use of different recreation types. So on the left, you can see a pretty vivid image of snowmobiling in one of our drainages, people playing around in the fresh snow. And on the right-hand side is a photo from some heli skiing. And can you see my mouse? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. The lines start up here, come all the way down here, and then they fan out on here. So heli skiing is a popular, although expensive, hobby up here in Western Canada. And one thing we noticed when we were flying was that there are patches of really intensively used areas like the snowmobiling area, but there's many patches and areas without a lot of activity, especially because we're studying an area with really big mountains that are difficult to access. So tying this back into the original questions of understanding where people are going and when, we are aiming to use these multiple data sources I mentioned before, so we can predict when, where, and how intensively recreation happens. And then more importantly, what types of recreation. So ideally, we'd be able to predict, for example, snowmobiling will occur in these types of terrain and habitat under these conditions. And we're tying this information back into wildlife because we're going to compare it with suitable habitat for our primary species of interest. And these include grizzly bears, wolverine, mountain caribou, and those are our primary species at this point in time. But that might change given how things progress. And with this overlap, we'll be able to see areas in space and time that have the highest potential for conflict, and specifically human-wildlife conflict, and also conflict between user groups. So we've done a little work so far on the effort to map wildlife habitat, and this was work done by a master's student, Gabe Shepins, looking at wolverine habitat suitability. So they took existing research, and that's an important component of this project, is that we're using existing research and existing data. And so this is on the left, or my left anyways, there's a map of the 4 different published papers, and you can see how they overlap. And they took results of those modeling efforts and predicted them across our study area, which is shown in the map on the right. And so it ends up with a spatial landscape of good to not so good habitat. And in these areas, we would expect to see perhaps more wolverine where there's high quality habitat versus less wolverine in lower quality habitat. So this would be the basis for being able to compare our human use model with the wildlife model.
Thanks, Annie. So we're getting to the end of the webinar. We want to give you a sense of where we're going next. We mentioned it's a multi-year project and we're in year 3. So 2021 was primarily focused on mapping trails. We're almost done that. 2022 is modeling human use, as Annie described. So and this is a huge gap that people typically don't do, and certainly don't do at this scale. People are very excited about those results. And then 2023, and this is roughly speaking, is starting to do more of the modeling of important wildlife habitat and tying those 3 things together. But throughout, there is ongoing engagement with partners and interested parties and public outreach. A really key lesson is do not wait until the end to tell people what you found. It's really important to work with partners all the way through to understand, is this what you need? Okay, it's not a little bit, we'll tweak it. Is this what you're expecting? And get feedback about the process. It helps to build the partnerships so that people can implement the results. Some parting thoughts and recommendations from us. Number 1, there are extraordinary data available. We are using 7 different types of data. Many of those will probably occur in areas that you live, work, and play in, but they need to be used more efficiently and more effectively. We really recommend using multiple data sources and seeing what works in different situations. Do they typically say the same thing? Do they say different things? They all have strengths and weaknesses. One is not necessarily better than the other, but it's understanding how to leverage those conventional and the newer methods and to really use this boom in technology to help us understand things in a more holistic, comprehensive ways. Number two, people are very interested in this topic, and that's for multiple reasons and across sectors. One thing I'll emphasize is it was a surprise to me how applicable these results will be for search and rescue and for safety reasons. As a primarily a wildlife biologist, it wasn't something that I had thought about until we started sharing some of the early results and getting feedback from people. So it really brings together, it shows how recreation is connected to many, many different aspects of our lives. Number three, it is so important to take a big picture view. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to study recreation across 60,000 square kilometers. It is ambitious, but I would encourage you to think across jurisdictions. People don't necessarily pay attention to jurisdictions when they recreate. Wildlife certainly don't. So for our results to be meaningful in nature, we should be thinking at large landscape views. But it takes time, it takes flexibility, and boy, oh boy, does it take collaboration. The last thing is that the results are worth it. This kind of work can really help to make a difference for both people and for nature, to reduce conflict, to make sure that we are safer, to have the kind of future that we want to have to steward these landscapes so that our children and our grandchildren will have marvelous outdoor experiences and continue to get benefits from these places. Last thing I'll leave you with is please learn more about Yellowstone to Yukon and the work we do. This project and many, many others. Our mission is to help connect and protect habitat so people and nature can thrive. We're on all, on all the major social media networks. We have a great website. Sign up for our newsletter. I subscribe to our newsletter and I work here. I read it every week and I learn something every week. So we would love to take questions from you. Please get in touch if you'd like to know more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aerin and Annie, for that wonderful presentation. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat at this time. And yeah, we do have a couple questions so far. I did want to read a comment from Pete. Pete said that overuse, overcommercialization of recreation, inappropriate use, conflicts between different recreationists is a major recreation-related or land use planning issue that the region faces, and Pete is in Southwest Virginia. So our first question is from Adam. What's the big purple bruise around Bragg Creek of non-governmental trails?
Annie, do you want to explain that and give some context for where Bragg Creek is?
Yeah, Bragg Creek is southwest of Calgary. And I think actually that might be a display bias, because you always have to have one layer on top of the other. So that doesn't indicate that they don't have everything captured at Bragg Creek, but there are some that are not. So it's sort of a mapping issue there.
Okay, thanks. We do have a question from Jim. What % of the trails you've mapped are rail trails?
Good question. We, off the top of my head, I don't know. Not many is my gut feeling. And Annie, please correct me if I'm wrong here. And also our wonderful conservation science technician, Talia Villalta, is joining us today. Talia, if you happen to know that, because you know all kinds of things about these trails, please feel free to put it in the chat. So I would say not many, although there are some, especially in Eastern British Columbia. I was actually recently there and skiing on some of the rail trails. They tend to connect between towns, but not large. It is a shockingly mountainous area. And so the places where the trains could go in the past and have now been converted to trails are not that common.
Yeah, compared to places in the US where I've seen a lot more rails to trails, there's much less in this region. So I would say it's a pretty small minority of our documented trails.
Thanks. Kevin said, it seems everyone and their dog is in the woods with one or more wolf descendants these days. Most current research and public discourse doesn't seem to acknowledge them, and management tools on public lands are inadequate to deal with them as a disturbance factor. Did your research consider dogs and their influence at all?
We didn't consider dogs directly. There's a lot of dog photos on the trail cameras, but in this case, we haven't directly used them in the project. I guess there's an assumption that we're having to make in some of these areas that places that are closer to urban areas are going to have more dogs, more off-leash dog activity. That's a big issue in some of these places like Canmore, where you have a town existing in a big wildlife corridor. So that it might be a smaller scale question, but it's not a question directly answered with this research. I don't know if you have anything to add, Aerin.
Yeah, you're right. And it is, so I think it was Kevin who asked that question. I have seen some research about that, not a great deal. And yeah, I would agree with Annie. It's not a main focus. We are thinking about what are some of the smaller scale places where we might go deeper into the future with this work, depending on opportunity, need, invitation. And that's something that has come up.
Great, thanks. Sort of a two-part question from Maggie. Have you recognized land use planning beyond trails? As in, there are certain areas that might be desirable for snowmobiling, as an example, but where snowmobiling is not permitted.
Great question. So for people who aren't familiar, land use planning is a tool that can and should be more widely used to help people decide the kind of future that they want for areas. So bringing together all kinds of evidence, and that includes science, Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge about areas, people's preferences, concerns about how different groups might interact, trade-offs and synergies, to come up with a plan for broad areas, usually done at fairly large scales. So in some types of planning in our region that this work is relevant for are regional land use plans. So around the city of Revelstoke, which is in eastern BC, much broader Indigenous-led conservation and conserved and protected areas planning. And some places that might be, especially with climate change, and in these places that are often climate refugia, the amount of snow that we have available for different types of winter recreation will not be there in the future. And so thinking about how climate change relates to this type of land use planning.
Thanks. Will you be comparing wildlife habitat with the related wildlife populations?
Yeah, good question. The plan is not in place for this project. I think the way I see recreation ecology, it's sort of in the beginning stages, but I think there's definitely need for that. We're just not addressing that in this project. I think the data that we have, you require a lot more information on the specific populations. And at this point, our focus is really on the human use side of things. So getting a better understand on sort of fine scale patterns. So it sort of provides a good stepping stone if people want to get into that, because those data are definitely available, but that's not part of what we're doing per se. But I think it could have definite impacts on, especially longer term impacts that we won't be addressing here.
Great.
Yeah.
And we have time for about one more question. Jeff says, I'm not seeing much in the way of a direct linkage between recreational use and impacts to resources, wildlife in this work. How has it been relevant to or applied by land managers?
Certainly, the amount of email that we get indicates that people are very interested, very relevant to their work. And it is early stages. So a lot of it is, are you done yet? Can we have the land use? Can we have the human use model yet? And the work takes a lot of time. So direct application so far. I hope to be back with Annie in a year to tell you what we found next and how it's been applied. But some of the questions that people are thinking about are these types of conflicts among users and how to reduce them, how to think about planning new trails, timing of activities. Annie, jump in if I'm forgetting anything specific here. Those are sorts of the general things, how to evaluate applications for different development opportunities when they don't have a conflict with important wildlife habitat when there's low conflict or potential for conflict among people and wildlife. And we're talking about big toothy animals that have large hooves and large antlers that can really be dangerous for people. When we talk about human wildlife conflict, that's what we mean. It's those are some of the things that people are concerned about. How do wildlife move past towns, not taking up residence inside towns? I don't want bears living in my backyard, and hopefully the bear doesn't want to be there either. Those are kind of some of the aspects.
If I can touch on that, though, I think that a lot of the information people are asking for is pretty basic baseline information that to us and to me starting out on this project is sort of surprised that information isn't available. So for example, finding trails where people can mountain bike in a centralized location, those data don't exist. So the question asking how it's relevant or applied by land managers, it's mostly not. It's definitely not done in a systematic way. And if it is, it's much more small scale. So for those of you who do work in this field, you might have different experiences, but in general, it's really at the level of collecting baseline information. So our primary objective here was mapping trails. And that is, it took a lot of work, but it's what I would think is baseline information. And that's where a lot of agencies are at right now. Even if there's a lot of support, there's not a lot of resources devoted to that. And that might be changing over time.
Awesome, thanks. We are at the end of our time for today. So I do want to say thank you to everyone for joining. And the couple questions that were in the chat that we didn't get to, I will make sure that the presenters are able to follow up with you about those. And yeah, just special thank you to both Aerin and Annie for presenting today. Please follow PNTS on social media so you can keep in touch with what we're doing going forward. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much for the invitation, for having us, and thanks everybody for joining. It's really exciting to talk about this work.
Thank you so much.